pleasure and an honor to introduce Elisa Betti from the University of Bologna. And we had a nice chat over the first dinner. And if you want to know everything about the history of Bologna, Elisa is your partner in dialogue. And she's a specialist in the history, in labor history, in a globalized perspective. And this is the paper she's going to present here. But she told me also about another interesting project about city twinning initiatives in Cold War, which she wants to open up with regard to Bologna and places like Leipzig. So we expect further papers to come, maybe not in this context, but in a different one. And now, without further ado, give a warm welcome to Elisa.
Thank you very much for this very kind introduction, and thank you for organizing this very interesting opportunity to meet all. My paper aims to conceptualize precarious work in the history of global capitalism, questioning mainstreaming ideas according to which the standard employment model is the norm of capitalism and precarious work is a historical exception. A gender historical perspective is adopted along with a global approach. The category of intersectionality is also relevant to show how gender, race, ethnicity, and to some extent age have played a crucial role in gaining or failing to gain higher level of job stability throughout the history of capitalism. This paper presents the preliminary finding of the ongoing project Gender and Precarious Work in a Historical Perspective, the European Context, I'm conducting at the Institute for Human Science of Vienna, but is also grounded on empirical research I've previously done on precarious work in Italy and Europe. In spite of the prevailing European perspective of my research, by adopting a global approach, this paper aims to frame the European discourse within a wider context, particularly useful for addressing the role of precarious work in the history of capitalism in terms of exception and norms. Let's say that precarious work and job precariousness can be considered a pejorative concept, to which the more neutral concept of flexible work and labor flexibility have been preferred by social political actors as well as several scholars. Among the early definition of precarious work and job precariousness, we should remember that of, for instance, Paolo Silos Labini, who associated precarious work with the Marxian concept of lumpenproletariat and identified precarious work as low-income casual workers. This is the correct slide. The first comparative definition of precarious work followed in the 1989 book, Precarious Job in a Labor Market Regulation, written by Rogers and Rogers, which also introduced the concept for the first time in the English language. Jerry Rogers defined as precarious those jobs with a short time horizon and for which the risk of job loss is high. No? Sorry. Okay. And job precariousness in this view involved instability, lack of protection, insecurity, and social and economic vulnerability. It's important to say that Rogers' definition of precarious work has become the main reference point for further elaboration of the concept. Well, coming back to the previous slide, it's important also to say that the concept of precariousness and precarious came from the Latin root precor, that means prey, and the first occurrence in European language can be dated to the Middle Ages or the early modern age, according to the different countries. There are other mainstreaming concepts that I'm not taking into consideration in the present paper that you can see in the slides, such as precarity in more existential meaning and precariat concept introduced by Guy Standing. It's important to say that there are no shared definition of precarious work in the socio-economic and legal science, and precarious work is not a statistical object fully measurable by statistic, nor a legal concept, and this is quite important for for the debate. And of course, there are several translations of the concept in the different European languages. You can see in the slide the most important one. It's important also to say that if we try to understand precarious work in a more historical perspective, it's important to take into consideration at least two sets of factors. Factors which we can define objective, such as wage stability, job length and continuity, the relationship between the labor contract and social labor rights. But from a subjective point of view, precariousness should be viewed in a relative manner and refer to the condition of the so-called stable workers, their self-perception and social perception. And in my own work, the attempt I'm trying to do as an historian is to historicize this concept and this phenomenon, try to question the very same definition of precarious work as a new phenomenon that appeared especially in the social sciences since the 1980s. The debate on precarious work is fully grounded in the European context, as was elaborated in contrast to the so-called Western standard employment model since the 1980s onwards. And in my mapping of the literature, I would say that a gender-blind approach prevailed in most of the studies regarding precarious work, and also a lack of historical perspective that is quite important because prevented the historicization of the concept. This conceptualization has been influenced by major historical transformation occurred in the last 30 years, such as the new phase of globalization, but also the transition of former communist countries from planned economy to market economy, but also specific turning points such as the 1970 crisis or the current global economic crisis. Also new approaches as influenced the debate on precarious work, such as the global and gender turn. Try to conceptualize precarious work in the history of capitalism, that is the main goal of this paper. We can recognize different interpretations that are related, let's say, at the beginning, surely to the European context, and then to a more global one. At the beginning of new millennium, precarious work was considered to be an exception to the alleged normal employment relationship, which in countries such as France, Germany, Italy, and Spain was associated with a more contractual form like the open-ended contract with statutory protection enshrined in a labor code. New forms of work, a typical non-standard contract, falling below the standard norm, were labeled as precarious, while job precariousness was regarded, as I mentioned before, as a new phenomenon appearing as a consequence of labor law deregulation and flexible labor arrangement introduced from the 1980s onwards. In the last decade, however, several authors have provided a relevant contribution for changing the above-mentioned paradigm. Precarious work can no longer be seen as an exception in the history of capitalism, considering not only the global north but also the global south. According to sociologist Jan Breman and global labor historian Marcel van der Linden, precarity along with informality and insecurity emerged as the real norm of the global employment relationship, not only in the current phase of capitalism, but also in the so-called golden age of the 20th century. In this perspective, Western countries were the only ones to fully benefit from the so-called standard employment relationship, which nevertheless was the norm only for a very limited period of time, the third quarter of the 20th century. Addressing Fordism as an exception and precarity as a norm, other two scholars, such as Brett Nielsen and Dan Rossiter, contribute to revealing how precarity should be conceptualized in relational terms. The adoption of a longer and wider perspective is considered the necessary background to understand that Fordism was the real exception of capitalism, an episode more contingent and shorter than imagined. Neither Fordism nor capitalism, according to these two authors, can be seen as homogeneous, and their experience itself of precarity is relational to this variation of capitalism. Adopting a southern perspective, according to Ronald Munk, work has always already been precarious. His critique of the literature on precarity is radical. Its empirical reference point is mainly northern-centric, according to Munk. From a global perspective, as Fordism, the welfare state, the Keynesian model were the exception to the rule, and they are irrelevant as a term of comparison in the global south. That's why it's impossible, according to Munk, translate the discourse of precarity as a descriptor of contemporary labor on a global scale. The relationship between precarious work and informal labor is particularly important, in his view, in a South-North perspective, as informality, always characterizing global South countries, is now increasing also in the global North. But precarious work is always rooted in the history of gendered capitalist relation of production, according to scholars adopting the category of gender and intersectionality, such as Leah Vosko. In deconstructing the idea of job stability as the norm of capitalism, even during the so-called golden age of the 20th century, between 1945 and 1975, this scholar has pointed out that precisely in that period the standard employment model became the normative conception of work. Investigating the relationship between precarious work and legal norms, Judy Fudge and Rosemary Owen showed to what extent national laws and policies reinforce gender rules according to which women, when they work, were usually employed temporarily in more unstable and precarious jobs until marriage. The discovery of precarious work in the 1980s was associated with the decline in the standard employment contract among men, since women had experienced former job precariousness even before. The alleged novelty of precarious work was a consequence, in this perspective, of the gender-blind approach adopted. And also another feminist scholar pointed out how precarity is capitalism is nothing new, and that normalization of neoliberal precarity has a long history in industrial capitalism. And to conclude on this stream of literature, precarity, according to Sanford Schramm, is the new normal of neoliberal capitalism. Sanford Schramm argued that 21st century neoliberal capitalism is not a completely new system, but a new phase of ordinary capitalism, which has always been characterized by high level of precarity. But looking also at recent historical research, the existence of form of work which we label precarious today emerged in different phases of capitalism, questioning from a long-durée perspective the exceptionality of job precariousness and its exclusive relationship with Fordism and neoliberalism. The perpetuation of rather similar forms of precarious work between the late 19th century and the mid-20th century, in spite of the changes in the organization of work and production, clearly emerged, for instance, from the studies conducted by Sophie Beau on the department store of Lyon, or by Augusto De Benedetti on glove manufacturing in Naples. Marc Leleu, instead, retraced form of precarious work in the industrial development experienced in northern France from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century. But the idea of the standard employment model as a norm has been deconstructed at the empirical level by studies adopting a gender historical perspective. Different production mode and working conditions were simultaneously present in both the Fordist and post-Fordist period, and women, as well as migrants, for instance, experienced a significant level of precariousness, even in the so-called golden age of the 20th century, as has emerged, for instance, from the study conducted by Safia Elisa Chocot on Italian seasonal workers in Switzerland, and my own studies on Italian women workers in the last 60 years. In spite of its heuristic limitation, the concept of precarious work and job precariousness has been increasingly applied at a global level to address the impact of the so-called neoliberal revolution. Together with a Eurocentric approach, the debate on precarious work has been highly influenced by a prevailing gender-blind approach, as I was mentioning before. Sorry, I got lost in my notes, but yeah, I think I can follow the slide. In particular, this approach investigates the impact of multinational company, of the the strategy of multinational companies at global level, and also the impact of the so-called global value change on workers' condition. New comparative studies had been conducted, especially on Latin America, Asia, and former communist countries. As what is interesting of this study is that they have adopted comparative methods and applied concept elaborated in Western countries, and this of course creates some kind of problem. The debate I try to briefly summarize have of course some kind of limitation. On the one hand, the model of capitalism analyzed in this literature is mainly the Western European, North American one. On the other hand, this stream of research don't take into consideration the existence of different stability models in, let's say, the third quarter of the 20th century, so not just the Western European, North American one, but also the Japanese and the one spread in former communist countries. Furthermore, the debate I've analyzed focused mainly on wage labor. So there is a lack of analysis of forms of work spread in other continents such as Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Furthermore, the variation of the model of stability and precarity have not been analyzed in connection with different economic sectors, because the main reference point of this literature is the industrial sector, taken as a model. And finally, the variation of capitalism and the different trajectories of precarity and stability in different countries across time and space have not been addressed as such. Coming to the conclusion, I think considering precarious work as the norm of capitalism is a useful operation for several reasons. Firstly, I think this paper has tried to underline the power of normative discourse in creating hegemonic norms. And in this regard, I'm talking about the so-called standard employment relationship, but also the relativity of norm. So how the change in the perspective adopted can, let's say, enlighten how the shift between norm and exception. And I think the precarious work debate enlightened this kind of shift. On the other hand, considering precarious work as the norm of capitalism have several implications. On the one hand, it implies moving beyond the normative discourse of Fordism, questioning the standard employment model, and investigating marginal workers as functional to the stabilization of the central one. On the other hand, it implies rethinking a basic platform of social and labor rights in more, let's say, political terms, because precarious work in the policy discourse are always seen as the other, taking for granted that the, let's say, permanent workers are still a majority, although statistics shows that is not anymore the case. And to conclude, in my ongoing project, I would like to address some more issues that have emerged from this paper. So the different model of stability and precarity I mentioned before, but also how the various norms of stability that I mentioned had got destroyed, and the relationship between informalization of work and job precariousness, analyzed already by some scholar, the relationship between precarious work and free labor debate, that is another huge question analyzed by some author. And to conclude, the relationship between precarious work as migration that is emerging from the stream of research on international migration. And finally, the relationship between precarious work and the meaning of work, because questioning the meaning of work from a feminist and post-colonial perspective, of course, implying analyzing different systems of labor relationship and not just wage labor as emerged from this debate I've analyzed. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Elena. I think we've been talking about the everyday this morning, the steps of understanding how we are embedded in the system, not on the precarious side, but maybe on the side of those who benefit from precarious work. We have 7 minutes for questions.
I will stay here for a few minutes. Okay. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. And I have to admit, I missed the beginning, so it might be something that you covered in the beginning, and so then I apologize for it. But I mean, I think your critique of this kind of normative model of there was once a time when everyone's work was non-precarious is very well taken, and it's something that I think several people have made quite convincingly. But I wonder what happens then to the kind of liberatory intent, I guess, behind that normative model. So, I mean, if you do have this model that once there were stable employment contracts and now there increasingly no longer are, that's the basis for a certain critique of this development. Whereas the more complex and probably kind of more empirically correct story that you are trying to tell, I guess the question is sort of then how would you translate that into a new kind of critique?
Maybe we can collect because there are few. So
Okay, she suggests to connect some.
since we have few.
Yeah. And I have a question.
Okay, so
To what
I can
extent
answer.
is precarious work embedded in different welfare systems? And to what extent do you have to take this into account? And I don't mean necessarily only the Bismarckian or Scandinavian welfare system, but also in Africa, family system. So that kind of shape the work and is not focused on contract, but people do not fall into the void, but into something else.
Okay. First of all, try to understand if I understood correctly from your question. Well, I don't assume that there is, as I try to explain, following this debate, I don't assume that there was a period of full stability compared to which now we are talking about full precarity. I mean, what I was trying to show is how, according to the perspective you adopt, you can deconstruct also the idea of full job stability of the, let's say, that was spread until the late 1970s. So this is the first thing. The second thing is, in this paper, I tried to analyze how precarious work has been conceptualized and to offer, let's say, an historical point of view on the shift that the debate has underwent that I think are closely related to the spread of this phenomenon and to the political mobilization also. When I talk about perception and self-perception, I think that in historical perspective it is very relevant because we can say that only in the, let's say, last 2 decades we have a clear perception from the social actors of what precarious work means and what precarity could be conceived. In the period I've analyzed before, for instance, 1950s and 60s, there were a lot of forms of work we can label precarious, but no one has the understanding of this phenomenon as such as we have nowadays. On the other hand, the welfare, it's a crucial aspect of the precarious work debate because, also according to the rule of the European Union, the precarity debate somehow is closely connected to this idea of flexicurity. That is supposed to merge the idea of flexible employment but security. Unfortunately, I would say that also according to several scholars, this idea has proved to not be so successful during the year of the economic crisis as it was supposed to be before. According to the limitation in the budget expense and so on. So it's an open question, and what is emerging is, for example, on the ILO policy paper is the need to rethink about welfare state, not in terms, as I try to say, that precarious work are the other in the welfare system, because the increasing amount of people can be defined precarious implies to rethink the welfare state in the Western countries, if you can't say that, or a new platform of, let's say, basic rights as emerged this conception in the ILO paper from a different standpoint. So for that reason, I think that considering precarious work not as an exception can be helpful in also reconceptualize the welfare system in order in a more universal way. That is a demand that has been put forward in the last, at least in the last 15 years, from several social movements, especially in Europe. So I don't know if there is something else.
So if there are no further questions, then we can finish just on time with this paper, not before saying thank you very much, Eloise. And with this, I say hello to Eva Initz and hand over to Michal, who will do a proper introduction.
Thank you so much for a beautiful session. And now you disappear, with Eva replacing you. Okay.